Hey everybody, happy Monday. My name is Matt O'Connell and this is Spoken Truth Revolution. Hey, thank you so much for tuning in, for engaging on social media, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, you name it. I really want to just thank you for your constant engagement. I think there's been a milestone made on Instagram. I think I just passed 1,000 followers. I don't know if that's a good thing, or maybe I should wait till I get to like 10,000 followers and then make this announcement. But needless to say, I think that's a lot. I think that's a good following. So I hope you benefit by the content that I deliver, the videos, the podcasts, etc. So again, I want to thank all of you for just your constant interactions, your likes, your shares, because again, it really takes all of us to share truth with the spheres of influence that surround us. So I have a sphere of influence, you have a sphere of influence, perhaps that I don't have access to. And so that's why you are so important as we engage this cultural battle for reality. And that's really what it is, right? It's a cultural battle in the U.S. for just the essence of reality. So a couple things for today. We're going to talk about Joe Rogan's podcast, how he calls out CNN, how different comedians such as Dave Chappelle stepping up for free speech, major airlines changing the vax mandate tune from the top down, and then other disturbing news about Fauci as well. So let's get into it. So Joe Rogan had CNN's chief medical correspondent, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, on his show, and Joe calls out Gupta, calls him out on the fact that CNN completely lied about Joe's doctor-prescribed medication when he had COVID. CNN called the prescription horse dewormer. And so why don't you take a look at this video and we'll talk about it in a few minutes.
Horse dewormer's not a flattering thing. I get that.
It's a lie. It's a lie on a news network, and it's a lie that's a willing. That's a lie that they're conscious of. This is not a mistake.
Yeah.
They're unfavorably framing it as veterinary medicine. Don't you think that a lie like that is dangerous on a news network when you know that they know they're lying?
The thing is, we're like going so fast. Like I feel like I'm missing.
Do you think that's a problem, that your news network lies?
Well, I don't.
Dude,
what did they say?
They lied and said I was taking horse dewormer.
So I'm so glad that Joe is just blatantly call out the chief medical correspondent for CNN, because everyone and their mothers know that CNN lies pretty much about everything. They exaggerate every story. They are super, super left leaning. They want the government, for whatever reason, to have a substantial amount of power, tyrannical power, and they're just pushing leftist agenda left and right, no pun intended. But Gupta then writes a summary piece. So we see in that podcast at Joe Rogan's podcast, where Gupta, he knows what CNN is delivering for content, especially around medical items. They likely there's an internal process where Gupta cross-checks to make sure what the anchors are saying are validated and true, or not, perhaps, or if there's a narrative to play. And so let's read. I want to pull up this article. Gupta wrote a summary in writing about his experience on the Joe Rogan podcast. And so here's what he writes. He writes, and I'm not going to, it was a fairly long piece. I'm just going to read the last, I think it's the last paragraph. So he writes the following. This is Gupta, who was on Joe Rogan's podcast we just saw. So he writes, I guess a small part of me thought I might change Joe Rogan's mind about vaccines. After this exchange, I realized it was probably futile. His mind was made up, and there would always be plenty of misinformation out there neatly packaged to support his convictions. Truth is tough. I am still glad I did it. My 3-hour-long conversation wasn't just with Rogan. If just a few of his listeners were convinced, it would have been well worth it. So Gupta and CNN, red-handed, caught in the lie. Joe Rogan was using ivermectin, and they were calling it horse dewormer. Joe was prescribed from a doctor, prescribed this medication to help treat his COVID symptoms. Okay, that's true. And they were calling it, CNN was calling it horse dewormer. And in addition to that, Gupta would not, you could see in the podcast, he was fun, he didn't know what to say. What did they say again, Joe? Did they really say that? Like, come on. If you're going to make an argument, if you're going to stand on a specific side, grow a set and stand on the side. Stop with this gaslighting, like you don't know. Like, if you're really convinced with your side and your persuasion, fight for it. Fight for it. And argue for it. Don't say that you're not doing something when you're caught red-handed doing something. So it was nice to see that Joe did that. So let's break down Gupta's comment in his article there. So he writes, Joe's mind was made up, and there would always be plenty of misinformation out there neatly packaged to support his conviction. So Gupta is still writing that Joe was spreading misinformation on his podcast, even though Joe was not spreading misinformation. And in fact, it was CNN spreading the misinformation. Gupta simply does not have the fortitude to stand by what he and CNN says. That's why the left will always lose the logical argument. And it's a result of them needing to gaslight and lie to the people and their viewers. They need to do that. They need to gaslight. They need to say, one, we said something, and then two, no, we didn't really say what we said before. Here's what we really said. You're just misunderstanding it, right? They can't just admit that they lie. And let's continue. So Gupta continues with this. Truth is tough. I am still glad I did it. If just a few of his listeners were convinced, it will have been well worth it. Yes, Gupta, the truth is tough. It's tough for CNN to tell the truth as well, isn't it? It's kind of an ironic statement for you to make out of anybody to say such a thing, especially for the network that you work for. It's too tough for you to admit, just like CNN and the rest of the mainstream media, to admit when you actually say and push something that is completely misinformation. And yes, I do agree. He mentioned if just a few of his listeners, meaning Joe's listeners, were convinced, it will have been well worth it. And yes, people were convinced by you, Gupta, convinced at the fact and proven once again that CNN practices sociopathic behavior and lies blatantly to support a narrative and ignore other truths that may discredit the narrative that they're attempting to push. Yep, you convinced them of that once again. The media has no integrity. No integrity. Integrity is you stand by your word, you have a conviction in your heart, and you're going to argue for it. And logical people, if they're truly wrong and they have that sense of integrity, perhaps those types of individuals will look at the data, look at the opposing argument, and if the opposing argument is objective enough to support their contrary claims, then a reasonable person may be swayed and convinced, hey, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'll look into this a little more. Not CNN. They'll just gaslight you till you're blue in the face, making you think that you're the crazy one, and they'll just, make a correction on page 1432 at the bottom footer with font size 6 saying that they incorrectly reported on something 6 months ago that no one will ever read or find out about. That's how CNN and the mainstream media works. So have you heard of this next story in relation to Dave Chappelle's special on Netflix called The Closer? And as you probably know, I never really watched Dave Chappelle. He's the style isn't my cup of tea. I know a lot of people like him, and I'll just spend just a minute about this particular story. This is from the Daily Wire. Comedian Damon Wayans says Chappelle freed the slaves with anti-PC special, talks freedom of speech. So Chappelle, in short, he cuts to the chase with things related to the gender discussion, and specifically around the transgenderism, gender dysphoria, in other words, which really what it is. But he says the following in his Netflix special, The Closer, and this is Chappelle. He says, gender is a fact. Every human being in this room, every human being on earth had to pass through the legs of a woman to be on earth. And so he goes into other things that the left freaks out about. And the point I want to make about the issue is the following. So I have a couple things I want to mention. So why is it that secular comedians are taking a bolder stance of freedom of speech and other constitutional rights than Christians are? I'm a believer in Jesus, as you may know. And my question is, why is it that comedians are spearheading the fight for these constitutional rights? And so it's just a question for, if you're a believer and you're watching this, it's a question to ask yourself. Sometimes Christians don't want to they look at what may be appearing as quote unquote political, and in the church, it's as if Christians should not be involved in political arguments, disagreements, etc. But I think we need to, as Christians, understand the history of our country. And as we dive into the history of our country, which I won't do right now, but our country was founded based on Christians who wanted to practice their faith freely and to be able to speak out freely. They left a place in which they were unable to do so. They were constrained. They were held in bondage, in other words, where they were not allowed to say what they thought, especially against tyrannical governments as well. And so if you're a believer in Jesus, you possess the power of God inside of you. And if the church woke up and stood boldly against these tyrannical crybabies, these cultural issues will dissipate in 3 months. If the church just got on board and realized that the battle that we're fighting, of course, is a spiritual battle, but a lot of churches will pray about, hey, Lord, will you please change the course and the direction of this country? Will you please change it? But few churches actually take action. And so the book of James talks about having faith, but letting your works prove your faith. And so it's not a matter of salvation. Won't get into that right now, but I think we need to pray and continue to think about, as Christians, how are we supposed to respond to issues? And so though I advocate, just to also as a disclaimer, I advocate for free speech. As it relates to getting and allowing people to speak, but it doesn't mean that I agree with all free speech. So that's truly what is amazing about this country. We have the God-given right to argue, to disagree, and to convince each other of our ideas and different philosophies and faiths as well. And so it's not that because I want free speech and I am an advocate of free speech, that means I totally support and agree with all kinds of free speech. That is not true. I believe in discourse. I believe in discussions. I believe that the best ideas will win out in the end. And if the church doesn't rise up, just listen to this real quick. If the church doesn't rise up in this occasion in which these cultural battles and which turn into political discussions as well. If the church doesn't rise up and get into the discussion, then the free speech will be without the sense of virtue and dignity. And that is probably even more dangerous than having constrained speech. So who will, even though these secular comedians and folks that perhaps are not believers in Jesus Christ or not Christians or not, perhaps, I don't know where their faiths are, but based on the content that they deliver, it would appear to believe, I would believe that they are not believers because they would have a sense of constraint in the content that they share and what they talk about and how they talk about it as well. But if the church doesn't begin to engage in these discussions of cultural issues, political issues, then the church is essentially relying on secular conservatism and conservatists to fight the battle for them. And not all folks who are conservatives are godly or have a sense of virtue. Not all of them do. But the church should have that. And the church should be the one spearheading those virtues and those ideas of dignity and respect and love for one another. And so we as the church can be a voice of virtue, dignity, and biblical truth to a fallen culture that simply needs Jesus. And so who do we want to rely on as it relates to engaging these discussions? Do we want to just praying is essential. So please don't take my words out of context. We need to pray. Absolutely. But perhaps your prayers are encouraging you as you're praying. Your prayers are encouraging you to begin to speak up a bit more from a Christian biblical perspective, not just a secular, this is the right thing to do perspective, but from a spiritual, divine, anointed perspective that you have, again, possessing the power of God, can truly not just change the culture, but change someone's eternity when we think about it, as we reflect on the gospel and what we're supposed to do. So that's just some food for thought as it relates to this. So I hope that more Christians begin to step up in this regard, because you're called to be a city on a hill and a lamp on a table. You're called to shine God's light through you. All right, this next article from CNBC, American Southwest CEOs say they don't plan to fire employees over federal vaccine mandates. The article reads the following: Southwest Airlines and American Airlines CEOs on Thursday, this was last Thursday, said they don't expect to fire unvaccinated workers, softening their tone as the deadline for a federal mandate approaches. Starting December 8th, the Biden administration will require federal contractors, including those two carriers, Delta, United, and others, to ensure that their staff are vaccinated against COVID-19 unless employees are granted an exemption for medical or religious reasons. Southwest and American have recently relaxed their rhetoric on the mandate, urging staff who don't plan to get vaccinated to apply for an exemption. Earlier this month, each carrier told employees they would need to be vaccinated or receive an exemption to continue to work there. If they can't get vaccinated, then we're asking them to seek an accommodation for religious reasons or medical reasons, and we'll evaluate each one of those, Southwest CEO Gary Kelly told CNBC's Squawk on the Street. As long as they're valid, we'll be approving those. I'm not going to fire anybody, Kelly said after the company released quarterly results. So, though it would be great to believe that Southwest, United, and Delta, and these other airlines did this out of the goodness of their heart, and they actually believed in the principles of America, freedom, so on and so forth, as far as why they're now disregarding the Biden's vaccine mandates. They're really, I hate to burst your bubble, if you're like, yeah, go CEOs of these major companies, standing against the man, Biden in this case, standing against, in the gap between Biden and his tyrannical policies and the American people. Yeah, that would be a fanciful idea, would it not? But they're not enforcing the mandates because they had to cancel thousands and thousands and thousands of flights as a result of employees protesting and walking off the job as a result of the airlines trying to promote the vaccine mandates. So why is it now that the CEOs are now on the side of their employees who have walked off the job, which resulted in thousands and thousands of flights needing to be canceled? Because these airlines cannot operate when they don't have any staff to operate these airliners, right? And so it boils down to dollars and cents. It boils down to that. I know you're going to hate me. I know I'm the bearer of bad news, but these companies are about dollars and cents. And let this be a good thing for you and I and anyone else watching this, just the ordinary person, just trying to make a living here in America. Let it be a testimony to the fact that these people, these ruling elites, they don't care about freedom. They don't care about your freedom. They don't care about your health. They don't care about you. They care about money. So that's how we need to respond. We need to respond with the mindset of what will hurt their pockets the most. And this is what hurt their pockets the most. these airline employees walking off the job, resulting in thousands and thousands of flights canceled, which relates to tens of thousands of millions of dollars lost in revenue. Okay. So they probably thought, these CEOs probably thought that the risk of paying the Biden vax mandate, if he's even able to enforce this mandate, is likely to be less expensive than not being able to fly thousands and thousands of flights. And so that's just the honest truth. Hate to break it to you that way, but that is simply what it is. And I'll probably say this is the biggest news story that you have not heard about if you're into the mainstream media. So make sure you share this with your friends. New York Post, NIH admits U.S.-funded gain of function in Wuhan, despite Fauci's denials. Here's what the article reads. It's another Fauci flub. The National Institutes of Health has stunningly admitted to funding gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses at China's Wuhan lab, despite Dr. Anthony Fauci repeatedly insisting to Congress that no such thing happened. In a letter to Representative James Comer of Kentucky, on Wednesday, a top NIH official blamed EcoHealth Alliance, the New York City-based nonprofit that has funneled U.S. funds to the Wuhan lab, for not being transparent about the work it was doing. Gain-of-function research refers to a virus being taken from animals before they are genetically altered in a lab to make them more transmissible to humans. So, Fauci, I'm tired of talking about this guy. In all honesty, Fauci, like I said, I have flip-flops that have Fauci's face on it. So if you're interested, let me know. I'll send them over to you. So not only has he flip-flopped on nearly every single issue about COVID, the lockdowns, etc., he has blatantly lied about his direct involvement and approval of funding the Wuhan lab that is suspected to have released the coronavirus, which has killed millions of people in the entire world and shut down the economy and made people lose their jobs and lose their businesses that they used their savings to get started. And now it's all gone because this guy has tried so hard to retain his reputation and has lied. He's just a blatant liar. Not only should he be locked up for lying under oath, but Fauci, he should be tried as a criminal. This is criminal activity. Misleading the public, misleading Congress, and resulting in millions of people dying. That is huge. I tell my kids when they do something wrong, if something, I have 4 kids, 3 of them are under the age of 6, so 6, 4, and 3. Okay. And if 2 of them are fighting, they both come up to me, I say, tell me the truth. And if you tell me the truth of what you did, the punishment and the consequences won't be as severe as compared to if you don't tell me the truth and I find out, your consequences will be more severe than if you just told me the truth at the very beginning. Fauci needs to learn this principle. He needs to learn this principle. If Fauci admitted everything at the beginning, if he just said, listen, we have a serious problem, I'll tell you anything that you need to know. Anything, I'm a public servant. I'm a public health official, right? I'll tell you anything you need to know about what is going on, how this was funded, and here's what my speculation is. If he did that at the beginning, we would be on a different trajectory as far as handling COVID and handling our economic policies as well, especially with China. Because in fact, this is a fact, right? In fact, the fact of the matter is that we, the taxpayers, have funded China, funded the Wuhan lab, which is now the likely epicenter of where the coronavirus derived from. And so if Fauci admitted everything at the beginning, if he actually cared for people, if he actually cared for human life, millions of them, in fact, who have died from COVID throughout the world, he would have admitted everything and would have been a great resource to help with the pandemic, but he did not do that. But he sacrificed what he could have done, which was told the truth at the beginning. Fauci sacrificed what he could have done, which was he could have done the right thing and told the truth, and he could have been transparent. And rather, he wanted to temporarily preserve whatever dignity and reputation he had left from a public standpoint. He wanted to preserve that. That was more important to him. His reputation, Fauci's reputation, was more important to himself than telling the truth and potentially saving millions and millions of people throughout the world. And the other thing about Fauci is the Star Democrat reports Fauci pressed over U.S. funding of cruel medical experiments on dogs and puppies, Beagles locked in cages with sandflies, vocal cords removed. Like, this picture is like, like if a child did such a thing to animals, like a psychiatrist would evaluate that child, be like, listen, like, I have concerns about your son or daughter. Like, usually it's an indicator that if a child is like mutilating animals, that's not a good sign. That is not a good sign. But let's read the article. So federal lawmakers are seeking answers from Dr. Anthony Fauci regarding potential U.S. funding for medical research involving cruel treatment of dogs, including puppies, locking beagles in with sandflies and removing of vocal cords to quiet their barking. Like, what kind of mad scientist is this Anthony Fauci? What other things do we not know about yet that he is doing with our tax dollars, with millions and millions of dollars? He's like a mad scientist that has resources upwards of millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars at his disposal. That is scary. That is scary. Does this alarm you? Not just COVID. COVID in itself alone should alarm everybody in knowing his involvement in funding such research. Like, why do you need to enhance a virus that doesn't exist yet? Now it exists because you enhanced it scientifically through human manipulation. Now, if it gets out, like, you're going to create a vaccine for it. So, like, what is the purpose of creating and enhancing a virus in the first place? Why not just not create a virus that's enhanced, that can kill people, right? Like, why would you do such a thing? And why would you do this to animals? Like, what is my liberal friends out there? If you listen to some of the segments that I cut out, and I try to do like minute clips and things like that just to get the word out. My liberal friends, does this behavior alarm you? Knowing what Fauci is doing, knowing that he's lied repeatedly, knowing that it is true that the NIH has funded the Wuhan lab in which the coronavirus likely escaped from that particular lab and killed millions of people, affected your families, affected your employment, affected the small businesses that you started and put your life savings in, and now has created tyrannical governments that are limiting your freedom. Does that alarm you? And does it alarm you that this guy is supporting research and funding research that is mutilating animals? Sandflies eating the heads of puppies? What in the world? What would this guy have to do to alarm you if these things don't alarm you? What would Fauci have to do if these two things, COVID and his support for COVID funding and so on and so forth, and mutilating puppies by allowing sandflies to devour their heads, if those two things don't alarm you, what would Fauci need to do to make you be alarmed? I have so many questions about this puppy experiment. Like, what benefit does this experiment have to promote science? Cutting the vocal cords out of the dogs because they were just barking too loud? They were barking because you were allowing sandflies to eat their heads. Does this alarm you? What would if it doesn't alarm you, what would Fauci need to do to alarm you? If a child, as mentioned, were to do this and a psychiatrist were to evaluate a child who was making a puppy to use sandflies to devour puppies' heads and to remove their vocal cords, the psychiatrist will be like, yeah, your kid's going to grow up an axe murderer. It's like, you'd be so concerned. Now these axe murderers are wearing lab coats and getting millions and millions of dollars from our tax money to do activities that axe murderers would do. They are psychotic at this point. The science community, if we look at Nazi Germany, they were experimenting on human beings and doing weird things, shrinking heads. Just look it up. Look it up. It is the most disturbing thing what Nazi Germany was doing from a scientific standpoint in their eyes. And we, as American citizens, are witnessing the scientific community not following the science, but they are tyrannical psychopaths. And we need to stand up against it. And we need to speak out, and we need to continue to share information about it, because the mainstream media and the big tech may try to stop us, but there are more of us than them. And so with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate each and every one of you. I pray for all of you. I pray for this country. God bless and have an amazing day. Take care.